Do you feel a shiver up your spine from fear? Yes, it's another story from the Nightshade diary. You know what that means. Check under the bed and make sure no one or nothing is there. Is the closet door securely shut? Then leave your disbelief behind, amp up your imagination, and hang on tight for another ride into terror and mystery. And like all good horror stories, just imagine it's a dark and stormy night. And remember, screaming like a little girl is permitted. The Pestering by D.K. Broster. When Evadine Seton and her husband bought the old cottage at Timsfield known as Hallows, it was not only because they had fallen in love with its charming half-timbered exterior, but also because it was remarkably cheap for its size, for they had very little money to spend. The war had ruined Captain Seton's health and left them at 41 a man who had, almost unwillingly, to take care of himself, and his wife possessed no particular talent save a light hand with cakes. The lease of their small and inconvenient flat in West Kensington having come to an end, a chance visit to the country, joined to a growing conviction that country air would be better for gas lungs than the petrol-laden atmosphere of London, had resulted in the transference to them of the ownership of a house which Evadine described in all her letters as absolutely heavenly. And though the Setons always spoke of Hallows as a cottage, it was really large enough to claim the more important title. Off its little square hall, there opened on one side Ralph Seton's den, which had a long French window, a later feature, of course. On the other side, a large sitting room with engaging lattice casements. There was also a third small room to serve as dining room. Above were 3 bedrooms and an attic running over all, but the rooms were low, so that in total height, Hallows did not exceed the dimensions of an ordinary 2-story house. All this accommodation, together with an attractive garden, rendered its very modest price a matter of self-congratulation, more especially as it was in good condition, and had indeed been recently redecorated, even to the distempering of the attic. All the Setons' friends who came to see it spoke enthusiastically of the extraordinary bargain which Ralph and Eve had picked up. Poor dears, they needed it. More than one made the remark, which caused Evadine to shudder, that the extreme picturesqueness of the place almost called for the title of Ye Old Something or Other, and it was left for Ralph Seton occasionally to wonder of the fact, which the title deeds revealed, that Hallows had so often changed hands after comparatively short periods of occupancy or ownership. The agents, however, were able to give quite satisfactory reasons for this, and in any case the drains were all right, for he had had them tested. The cottage, however, had one slight disadvantage. It stood almost on the high road, at the turn just outside Timsfield village, and though in that byway of a notably placid countryside there was less motor traffic than would have shrieked or pounded past elsewhere, still, when summer came, cars bearing the rheumatic visitants to the neighboring spa developed a habit of pulling up outside to admire the sweetly pretty cottage, the roses clambering on the black and white, and the tall fluted Tudor chimneys, of which 2 survived in their pristine elegance. The Setons were a little annoyed, and one day when a carload of lusty holiday-makers from Birmingham rang and asked if they did teas, Mrs. Seton dismissed the inquirers with some curtness, and entered her husband's sanctum with a heightened color. "What's the matter?" asked Captain Seton, looking up from the printed foolscap document at which he had been frowning. Evadine told him. "Rage becomes you, I declare," he observed. And indeed, Evadine, who was 36 and whose thick, unshingled brown hair was threaded with gray, looked for the moment quite handsome, but her husband's smile was transient. "Come here a moment, will you, and look at this. It's from the Silverdale Trust. Even the mortgage debenture holders will not receive a penny this half-year." The flattering color left Evadine's cheeks. "Oh, Ralph, another investment gone wrong?" No, my dear, of course, I'm not blaming you. I know it's only the bad times, but... And I did so want you to have some of the new treatment this autumn." Captain Seton had his new treatment in the autumn, even though he received no dividend from the Silverdale mortgage debtors. The demand of the trippers that afternoon had given Evadine an idea, and the more her husband fought, the more she had held it. She would do teas, and he was absurd and abysmally behind the times to think of objecting to it. Heaps of people like us to do it, and you know I can make scrumptious cakes, and Hallows does attract motorists. We can use the garden if it's fine, the large room if it's not. I could probably hire tables, for it will only be for a couple of months or so. So very soon old Jacob Friend, the builder, spectacles on nose and tongue following the movements of his hand, was creating with intensity no less concentrated in its way than was behind that brush which once swept the ceiling of the Sistine, that one word tease, in large letters on a small signboard, which was to provide Timsfield with a topic of conversation, to please thirsty wayfarers, and in about a month's time to cause opulent sufferers at the spot to say to the chauffeurs, "I think we might drive around by Timsfield today. Smithson, I hear there are very good cakes to be had at that tea place there, the old Tudor house, I think it's called." The Seatons had not at first realized that this particular spa had practically a 10-month season, a fact which, while it proved financially profitable to them, meant that Evadine was never surprised to be asked for tea from 3:30 onwards, even in October. So it was only with a mild surprise that she had heard the bell ring as she was seated by the hearth late one afternoon, reading The Silver Spoon by firelight, and rather unwillingly got up. Yet the surprise deepened when she realized that it was already dusk outside. However, it took no time to boil a kettle on a premise, and her cakes were always freshly made. Ralph had gone to Birmingham for treatment that afternoon, and the village maiden who helped her had departed home some time ago. But as Evadine was always prepared to serve teas herself, if need arose, she went to the door without more ado, only regretting leaving the fire in the society of Michael Mont. When she opened it, she was surprised again at the depth of the dusk outside. The creeper leaves which fringed the porch were drained by their bright colors. The porch, small as it was, seemed quite shadowy, and shadowy, too, was the figure who stood in it, an old man, as far as she could see, in a hat as wide as those beloved of the Chelsea artist, and a cloak to match. Only she was not even quite sure about that. The light was so bad. "Good evening," she said briskly. "I suppose you want tea?" There was complete silence for a moment. Then the visitor said in a low, slightly hurried tone, "I am come about the chest, mistress." "Chest?" repeated Evadine, puzzled. "What chest?" Then she remembered that a chest of tea, ordered the previous week from London, had not yet arrived. "Oh, are you the carrier? You have got it there, then? I was afraid it had gone astray." The man moved a little. "Aye, it had indeed gone astray, and I want it. I wish to take it with me, if you'll kindly allow me, mistress." "There's some mistake," replied Evadine. "I'm expecting it. From Twinning's, there's no question of sending it back, particularly as it hasn't arrived yet." The old man had come quite close to the door now. Somehow Evadine did not like his nearness, and wished that Ralph were not out, and she alone in the house. "Not arrived?" he exclaimed, and still his voice sounded just as far off as before. "I was told that it was brought to this inn long ago, when—" "But this is not an inn," interrupted Mrs. Seaton. "You have certainly made a mistake. Good evening." Yet she still held the door open, for despite her half dislike of her visitant, she was curious about him. "Not an inn?" he repeated. "When folk come here every day for refreshment? Mistress, pray, let me have the chest." "How can I?" asked Evadine, more and more puzzled, "when I don't know anything about a chest?" "I am so weary of asking," sighed the faraway voice. "Have pity on me, sweet lady, and let me come in and fetch it away." "No, you cannot come in," said Evadine, with decision, suddenly she knew not why, afflicted not with pity but with a strange trickle of fright. "There is no chest here," and she shut the door. After a while, slow dragging footsteps went out of the porch. The old man, thought Evadine, listening on the other side of the door, was probably a little crazy. She would make inquiries about him in the village. He gave somehow the impression of considerable age, like Hawkins, the ancient beekeeper. Only that old boy certainly had all his wits about him, as witnessed the price he had asked her for his honey. And the idea of thinking that Hallows was an inn. She only wished that she were not obliged to admit strangers and give them tea. But there beggars could not be choosers, and financially her enterprise was well on the way to fill up the hole left by the missing dividends. When her husband came back about an hour later, she told him of the old carrier body, or whatever he was, and his request, and how he had stood in the porch asking. Ralph Seaton interrupted her. "Eve, you must have been having an orgy of cocktails in my absence." "Porch? What do you mean? Hallows has no porch." The silver spoon fallen to the floor, she stared up at him. "No more it has. What can I have been thinking?" She passed a hand over her forehead. "But, Ralph, I saw it. I saw the edge of it, the leaves." "You might make your fortune if you could remember what you put in that cocktail," was all her husband would say. "No good assuring me that you didn't have one. Don't look so worried, old thing." "But I am worried," responded Evadine. "Ralph, do you think I can be going mental?" "No, I think you were dazed with reading and fancied yourself back at your old home, where I seem to remember there was a porch, or somewhere. No, I won't get you certified yet." October passed into November, and Evadine still dispensed a few teas. Ivy, the help from the village, now stayed later, and it was about 6 o'clock one evening that she came up to her mistress, who was drying her just-washed hair by an oil stove in her bedroom, with the intelligence that there was a queer sort of a man at the door asking somewhat about a chest what he was to take away. "What?" ejaculated Evadine, flinging down her towel. "A chest? What was the man like? Never mind. I'll get your master to go." And with her half-dried hair streaming over her dressing gown, she ran downstairs quite perturbed. It was, nevertheless, a fact that she had hardly given her visitant of last month much thought. His queerness had been swamped at the time of the fact of her own, and imagining an architectural feature which did not exist. She burst into her husband's room. "Ralph, there's that man again at the door. At least there is a man. After that chest. Do go to him." "Can't Ivy see to it?" asked her husband, who was writing a letter. A glance had shown him that his wife would not, at least with decorum. "Oh, all right." He got up and left the room. "I wonder if Ralph also will see something that isn't there," thought Evadine. In a moment, Captain Seaton was back. "There's not a soul at the door," he said rather crossly. "What did that little fool mean?" "I suppose he has gone away again," said Evadine with a sense of relief. "So sorry, dear, and I apologize for coming in like this." In the hall she encountered Ivy, and mildly upbraiding her, she was met with a reply. "Oh, Mum, but it was the back door, and he's still there. I can hear him." "You haven't left it open?" "Oh, no, Mum." "Well, go back and tell him that there is no chest for him here, and that it is no good his coming like this. There's a mistake somewhere, as I told him before." Ivy hesitated, getting very red. "Please, Mum." "I don't like to." "Nonsense. I can't disturb your master again, and I can't go like this." For all answer, Ivy abruptly burst into tears. Interspersed with his watery and far from silent protest were phrases which sounded like, "It's begun again. Everybody said it would," and more intelligible ones, displaying an immediate desire to go home to her mother. "If you can't answer the door, you're certainly better go home," remarked Mrs. Seaton dryly, only to be met with fresh sobs and the declaration that for nothing on earth would the sobber go outside the house this night, now that it had begun again. With a gesture of vexation, Evadine left the weeping nymph, ran downstairs, caught up her discarded towel, twisted it around her head, and came down again. "Since you are so useless, I must go to the back door myself," she said severely, half hoping to shame Ivy into doing her duty, And in any case, the man will have got tired of waiting by now. The handmaid lifted a flushed, scared face. Oh no, he don't never get tired. He's been at it too long. She burst into a fresh howl, demanding her mother and lamenting that she had ever come to Hallows. Thoroughly annoyed, Evadine Seton, in her turban-like headgear, marched through the warm homeliness of the kitchen with its gleaming saucepans and stolid ranks of canisters comfortably labeled rice, flour, and sugar. The outer door was fast shut. She could see that Ivy had shot the bolt. But what was that clinking sound proceeding from it? Evadine stopped, her hands tightening on themselves. The thumb piece of the latch was lifting in a continuous and regular jiggle, as though someone was shaking it from outside. Evadine drew her breath hard. Must she open that door? Yes, if only because she had scolded Ivy for her cowardice. And besides, there was always Ralph within call. Bracing herself, she set one hand on the bolt and took hold of the latch with the other. Under her thumb, it thrilled gently to that pressure outside. I can't do it, she whispered, suddenly frightened to her inmost soul, though all the time something in her brain was saying reassuringly, Rubbish, it's only a crazy old man, or the wind. Setting her teeth, she plucked open the kitchen door, and she would have been glad, after all, to see that crazy old man, for there was no one there. No one whatever, only empty, windless darkness. I was an idiot, of course, she said, half an hour later in her husband's den. But I really was scared for a moment, infected by that silly Ivy, I suppose. By the way, did she apologize at all as you took her home? For it had ended in Captain Seton's having to escort his timid domestic back to her mother's cottage. She? My dear girl, is it likely? I don't think we either of us spoke. As a matter of fact, I confess that I was too much bored by the whole business. Mrs. Miller was a bit apologetic. Come to think of it, I fear we should never have imagined a country girl would get the wind up so easily. They must be more or less used to tramps. If it was a tramp, said Evadine in a low voice, as she bent to poke the fire. Apparently, Ivy Miller, country-bred though she was, had no fancy for possible further dealings with old men at back doors, or else her nervous system was unusually high-strung, for she did not turn up next morning. In the middle of luncheon, however, arrived a remarkably ill-spelt note from Mrs. Miller, intimating that my daughter don't feel as she give, a word which, from the context, must have been satisfaction, up at Hallows, and will you kindly take her week's notice, and will not ask no wages, your truly Mrs. Miller. Look at that, said Evadine angrily, passing the missive across the table. Tiresome woman. I must go and reason with her. And Ivy was just getting nicely into the way of the teas. Why go and reason? Asked her husband, cutting himself a piece of cheese. Ivy's a brainless chit. You can easily get another, can't you? And one who won't go into hysterics if she is asked to go to the door in the dark. And have all the bother of training her? I shall make an effort to get to the bottom of this business first. I'll go this afternoon, before any tears can turn up. But a party of these individuals came very early that afternoon, and it was not until dusk had begun to set in that Evadine was able to invade Mrs. Miller's dwelling. Her interview there was most unsatisfactory. No, Ivy had nothing to complain of. She had always been treated most kind by you and the captain, Mum. But she didn't feel she give satisfaction, and she didn't like coming back in the dark, and it wasn't in reason that the captain should bring her home every evening, poor gentleman, him with that cough and all. In fact, she'd rather not stay out her week. We can quite manage, thank you, Mum, without the wages. Sorry to put you about, but we all know there's difficulties about Hallows, and no offense intended, I'm sure, and I hope none taken. Difficulties? Exclaimed Evadine. What do you mean by that, Mrs. Miller? What sort of difficulties? The people who came for teas, but most of them give Ivy a tip, and I make all the cakes myself, if it's the extra washing up. Mrs. Miller looked down and smoothed her apron. She was a neat body, which was one reason why Ivy had been selected for a post. "Oh no, Mum, it's not the people who come for teas. Oh no, oh dear no." The slight peculiarity of her tone spurred on Evadine to further investigation. "Then what people do you—" she was beginning when unfortunately Mrs. Miller's laborer son clumped into the cottage, home from work, and the sentence and the investigation were cut short. Evadine thereupon took her leave, not having seen the recalcitrant Ivy at all. As she went homewards in the dusk, she thought that perhaps Hallows, from standing empty, though it had not so stood for so long, had gained a bad reputation as the haunt of tramps or undesirables. Yet it was not a solitary place. Anyhow, the affair was most annoying and not too reassuring for the prospects of replacing Ivy. It was getting too late now to go around to other cottages and endeavor to find some female to come the next day. But tomorrow was Saturday, together with Sunday, the heaviest day for teas. Wrathfully musing, Evadine went past the churchyard with its spiky yews, came to the turn of the road and saw the light from the living room at Hallows slipping out cheerfully through the half-drawn curtains. And she saw too, but could only just see, that someone was standing inside the gate, as if waiting for her. Foolish of Ralph to do that in the damp. "Go in, you old silly," she called out. "How long have you been there?" The person standing inside the gate did not answer, so it was not Ralph, and she wished she had not called out to him. It was not until she actually had her hand on the gate to push it open that she recognized something familiar about the outlines of the figure, about the headgear in particular. Feeling rather sick, she paused with her hand on the wood. It was he, the tramp, and he was on the inner side of her own gate. She would have to pass him, and she almost distinctly did not want to do so. But she could not allow herself to be a second Ivy. Besides, he was in her own garden, where he had no right to be. Horribly afraid, all the same, that he was going to try to keep her out, and if he does, I shall hit him, she thought with a tremulous vindictiveness. She pushed open the gate and went through. "What do you want?" she demanded, without stopping, for the faster she walked, the sooner she would pass him. But she did not seem to have to pass him. He was not where she expected. He was beside her, shuffling along through the fallen leaves, at the edge of the path and keeping up with her as she went. "What do you want?" she asked again, sharply, looking straight ahead as she spoke, and continuing up the path. "I can't have you coming here like this." "You have just told me to go in, mistress," said that flat, far-away voice. "It is true that I am old and silly, as you said, but you told me to go in. You are kind, after all." At that, Evadine stopped. "I never told you to go in. I thought it was my husband. Go away at once, or I will call him." She was shivering with a sudden, unnameable disgust, and she began to run. The becloaked old thing kept up with her. "Kind, kind," the voice repeated, almost in her ear. "You told me to go in. You asked me how long I had been waiting." "Kind, kind," Evadine struck out with her left arm, but she must have miscalculated the distance. Her hand merely brushed the lavender bush by the door, so she knew she was quite near safety. "You shall not come in. You shall not come in," she cried. Then she turned the handle, huddled through, banged the door, and fell on her knees inside, pushing against it with all her might, and shrieking, for at last she could keep it no longer. "Ralph, Ralph, come and lock the door. Ralph, come quick. He's trying to get in. Ralph, for God's sake." "Well, you did give me the dickens of a fright," said Captain Seaton. He was standing over his wife with brandy, and Evadine, to her surprise, was uncomfortably disposed on the little sofa in the living room. "Here, for heaven's sake, get this down." Ralph was pale himself, paler even than he usually was. Through chattering teeth, Evadine swallowed the brandy and felt better. I'm like Ivy, aren't I?" she said, trying to smile. "You'll have to go to the police, I'm afraid." "But look here," said he, "weren't you imagining things? No one was trying to get in, I'm sure." He began to rub her hands. "You're as cold as ice, my dear girl. Did he try to stop you coming in? Was that what you meant?" "No, he wanted to come in too. He said I told him to, as if I should." She shuddered. I thought it was you at first. He was standing just inside the gate. But I can't think why you should have got the wind up so if he didn't really threaten you. He said I was kind. Me kind? To that creature? And Ralph, he sort of shuffled along beside me, and his clothes smelt so musty. I shall go and light the stove in our bedroom, and you must go straight to bed. Yes, I've locked the front door and the kitchen doors fastened too. Now, my good girl, you cut off upstairs, and I'll bring you up some hot soup. You said you had made some, didn't you? No, sir, responded Sergeant Cook, whom Captain Seaton had the luck to meet next morning in the village. No, I never heard of any old tramp in a cloak, such as your lady describes, about these parts. No, I never heard as tramps were partial to Hallows. Now, if you've seen him yourself, Captain Seaton. Unfortunately, I haven't, Sergeant. My wife, however, is not a fanciful person, nor one easily frightened. I wish you'd keep an eye lifting for a few evenings. I will, sir, certainly. Might he perhaps be a lunatic, do you think? I haven't any theories, Cook. For all I know, he might be, but there's no asylum near here. The first time this fellow came to my wife, says he appeared to think that Hallows was an inn. Does that throw any light? Ah, said the sergeant deeply. Well, it might, or it might not. Was Hallows ever an inn? Couldn't say, sir. Best ask some of the old villagers about that. Friend, for instance, or old Hawkins, him that keeps the bees. Oh, the rustic with the protectionist ideas about the price of honey. And Jacob Friend. Now that I come to think of it, my wife reported a curious thing which Fred said to her when she gave him the order to paint us a sign. He told her that she was a brave lady, braver than she knew. She thought he meant, well, undertaking that sort of thing, you know. Quite so, sir, but it may be as he meant more. Them old villagers. I'm not a Timsfield man myself, but this here undesirable hasn't ever come to ask for refreshment, has he, sir? No? What he wants apparently is a chest, which he seems to think we have. Ah, a chest. That sounds old-fashioned, don't it? I'd go and see Friend or Hawkins if I was you, sir. And on that advice they parted. Captain Seaton had little knowledge of what bees did in winter, but it was plain what a beekeeper did. If he was of the age of Mr. Hawkins, he kept by the fire, was careful not to admit the slightest breath of air into his retreat. For months probably, said the visitor to himself as he entered it, hibernation, if not suffocation. However, Mr. Hawkins was not even hibernating. His little eyes were quite alert, and the hat which he presumably kept as a permanency on his aged head, lest after all his precautions some faint breath of air might visit it, lent him the appearance of being ready to set off out of doors, the more so since, sitting by his fireside, he leant both hands upon a stout stick. He had to the life the air of a stage rustic, and a badly made-up one at that. Captain Seaton could have sworn that spirit gum was the medium which kept in place the unconvincing collarette of white beard which surrounded his pallid moon face, singularly unwrinkled for his age, which was reputed to be close on 90. A little woman who referred to him once as Grandfer, but otherwise with some coldness, merely as he did the honors of the cottage. Good morning, Mr. Hawkins, said his visitor, and so strong was his sense of taking part in amateur theatricals that he nearly added, and how be bees, or something in that strain. However, he restricted himself to, I hope you are well. Good morning, sir, responded the ancient in a little cracked voice. I'd be doing nicely, thank ye. He's not so troubled with the rheumatics as some winters, observed the hostess during a chair. Please to take a seat, sir. Sometimes, remarked he, taking up the cue, I has the lumbago pitched in me, back sometime cruel, so that I be fair stuck like. You are a good age, Mr. Hawkins, aren't you? Though you carry it remarkably well, Ralph hastened to add. The moon face emitted a chuckle. I be 103 come next month. Or be it 104, Bessie? Tain't neither, replied Bessie sharply. Don't take no notice of him. When he talks like that, sir, she advised, the somewhat startled Ralph. He ain't no good at figures. No, complacently agreed the ancient, for at any rate he was that. I never could be bothered with rhythmic. Rheumatics is more in my line now. But 'tis bees as I knows about. Will it be aught to do with them little critters as you've come about, sir? No, Mr. Hawkins. But whatever your exact age, you are undoubtedly, I believe, the oldest inhabitant of Timsfield. Aye, that I be, responded the soi-disant centurion proudly, and possibly with the idea of prolonging this distinction, he settled his hat more firmly on his head. Years and years older than the rest of 'em put together, I reckon. Now, Bessie, hold thy tongue. I can remember old Passon as Alice wore a wig in the big floods 80 years ago, and the times when a loaf of bread costed. And a good deal about the houses in the village, too, I dare say, put in Captain Seaton, to whom general reminiscences were of no value. For instance, there's my present cottage, Hallows, you know, at the turn of the road. I'm naturally interested in that. Do you remember any old stories about that? The face within the collarette changed in some indefinable way. To Captain Seaton it looked as if Mr. Hawkins had said to himself, "Now you be careful." "Ah, so you be the gentleman as has bought aloes," he remarked slowly. "And how do aloes suit ye, sir?" "Very well, thank you, Mr. Hawkins, but I should like to know something of its past history." "A many would like to know that," responded the beekeeper, propping his chin on the top of his stick. "Now, Bessie, quit fiddling there. It's his time, sure. He went for to do some shopping." And to Ralph's surprise, Bessie rather resentfully withdrew. "I can't abide women," observed Mr. Hawkins, as the door closed. "'Tis a great pity a man has to put up with them buzzing about like so many bees, only not so near, so sensible, and so sees likes. Allow, sir, don't find it to have no inconveniences." Ralph looked at him steadily. "That depends on what you mean by inconveniences." Mr. Hawkins tried to scratch his head without removing his hat, a proceeding which a good deal disturbed the poise of the latter. "Well, sir, being as I'm so old, I remember there was talk of folk being pestered like. But that's a long time ago." "Pestered by what?" The old man leant forward over his stick, glanced around, and dropped his voice. "By him, sir." Ralph's heart gave a queer little thump, which surprised him. There was something in it then, or was supposed to be, but he merely asked after a moment, "What him?" "Him, as is always asking for it," replied Mr. Hawkins, his piping voice sunk almost to a whisper. And then, as Ralph gave no sign, he went on hurriedly and with an air of relief. "Oh, then, sir, if you ain't been worried, no need to say no more about it. There's some as is and some as isn't." "It's true that I personally have not been worried," said Ralph, after a moment's consideration, "but I must admit that my wife has." "Ah," Mr. Hawkins sucked his lip. Then he leant yet further forward in his chair and said, still in a tone as if he feared to be overheard, "Best tell her never to let the young man in. See as she never does that. But as far as I can gather, it's not a young man. It's an old one. At least, that's what my wife's impression, though of course the whole thing is probably an illusion," he added half to himself. "I wouldn't call it no name, sir," advised Mr. Hawkins gravely. He drew back in his chair and appeared to reflect. "So it seems old now, do it? Well, it have been asking a mort of years, by what folks do say. My father, now, he remembered it, and my mother, Alice, swore she saw it one evening knocking on the door of Hallows. But as long as no one don't never ask it in, sir, I reckon 'tis all right, for it seems it can't come in without 'tis invited, like. 'Tisn't as if Hallows was an inn. Was it ever an inn? My wife said the man at the door spoke of this inn the first time he came." "Did he now? I don't remember of it being an inn, nor my father didn't. Some says it was, once." Ralph Seaton, puzzled, uncomfortable, turned to another point. "This chest, now, that he asked for, a chest which he said had been left there. Aye, he would, murmured Mr. Hawkins, nodding his head. Alice, the same thing, a chest it be. And by this time Ralph no longer saw him as a comic rustic. He really did seem to have some roots back in a curious past which had small affinity with the present of unceasing loudspeakers and weekly record-breaking aeroplane flights. There is a tale about a chest, then? There's a tale about him allus asking for a chest. But there wasn't no man living, even in grandfather's day, as knew aught about a chest, and no chest ain't never been found in Hallows. Then it's not much use his keeping on asking for it. No, sir, it ain't. But I suppose that's just what he'll do. Keep on asking, seeing as he don't never get it. A nice lookout that for the occupants of Hallows, exclaimed Captain Seaton. We have lost a maid over this business already, and I very much fear that my wife may have difficulty in finding another in the village if this tale gets about. 'Tain't no question of it getting about, sir, corrected the sage, 'cause 'tain't no new tale, if you understands me. Only him not having been seen for some time, it might have been a bit forgot. I wonder now what could have started him off again. The words woke an echo of what Evadine had reported Ivy to have said on that score. Evidently, even the young people of Timsfield knew, at any rate in theory, of the pestering of Hallows. A cheerful prospect if Evadine failed to get a maid. Just now, too, when they were making a little money over the teas, much as he himself disliked that method of earning it. But what is the legend, the tale behind this, he really did not know what to call it, and finally came out with this nuisance. Can you recall having heard anything as to its origin? Who brought the chest to Hallows, and when, and what was supposed to be inside of it? The old beekeeper was probably not conversant with the vulgarisms of "now you're asking," but his expression conveyed that sentiment as he slowly shook his ancient, behatted head. Captain Seaton went out through the blackened Michaelmas daisies and dahlias of Mr. Hawkins' crowded little garden, not knowing what to think. By the time he got home, he was almost wondering whether Evadine's inopportune old man could be accounted for on the theory of mass suggestion. If not, he was faced by an uncomfortable dilemma. Either he must believe in this spectre and his chest, which he could not bring himself to do, or else Evadine, of all people, was developing nerves or hysteria. Delusions, in fact. His mind revolted from both alternatives. The immediate question was, what was he going to tell her about his inquiries? Wouldn't the best thing be to say that neither Sergeant Cook nor the oldest inhabitant knew anything about the business? But then, he had not the habit of lying to his wife, nor to anybody else for that matter. He was relieved to find that he need not come to an immediate decision on this point. A notice was pinned on the front door which said, "No teas provided today," and on the hall table he found a note informing him that his wife had had no luck servant hunting in the village, and had taken the little Austin and gone over to Worcester's to registry office. "May not be back to tea, so don't wait," it concluded. "Cold lunch, sorry," on the table. So she had failed to get a maid in the village. Of all the cursed nuisances. He went for a walk after lunch by the old canal, long out of use and undisturbed, as picturesque under its drooping trees as any river. It had no trace of movement in its unstirred waters, so little indeed that the drift of red beech leaves and of green ash leaves lay upon its surface as upon ice, the stillest waters he had ever seen. The beech trees in their last glory made of it an enchanted waterway. Ralph turned out from it after a while and did a round. When he got back to Hallows, it was practically dark. Evadine had not returned, evidently for the little garage door was still open, and the house was unlit. Captain Seaton let himself in and went towards his own den, extracting his pocket lighter. Just outside, however, it slipped from his fingers, and while he was groping for it on the floor, he became aware, to his surprise, that there must be someone in his room, for he could distinctly hear a noise in there. He raised himself and listened. Yes, a series of dull thuds or thumps, apparently against the paneling of the wall. Everdeen must be back then. But what on earth was she doing? He gave up hunting for his lighter, for Everdeen would presumably have lit the lamp in there, opened the door and said, "What in thunder are you up to, Eve? And in the dark, too," for the room was not lit, save by the mere scrap of glow from the hearth. But no one answered him. The thudding had stopped. There was not a sound, nor could he see anyone in the room. Yet that someone was there, he was certain. By the draught which the opening of the door had caused, he knew that the long French window must be partly open. Had he left it so when he went out? "Who is it? If it's you, Eve, don't play the silly ass." For the only answer he heard was sounded like rough-skinned hands rasping over the paneling. It wasn't even here. "Here, you," he called out threateningly. "Get out of this," and made a dash for the corner whence the rasping appeared to come. He touched nothing, it is true, but he had the impression of something bundling rapidly to the other side of the room, something that diffused a moldy smell as it moved. He even thought that he saw it, very indistinctly, cross a somewhat lighter oblong which was the uncurtained French window. Filled both with rage and with something of which he had known the like before, in Flanders, Ralph hurled himself in the dark towards his bureau, on top of which he kept an electric hand lamp for emergencies. Found it, switched it on. It threw its strong but narrow beam into the corner on the other side of the window. Nothing there. He swept the room with it. Nothing. A long breath of relief shook him. Now, if he had been having cocktails. Then, as he was starting, electric lamp in hand, to leave the room in search of his drop lighter, he did see something. Something that sat huddled, almost into a ball, in his own chair by the dying fire. Something covered with what looked like a rotten and tattered dark brown sack. Something that had earth-colored hands clasped over the shrouded head, which was bowed to its very knees, if it had knees. Something that was whimpering to itself in a dusty, faraway voice. "Not here, not here, not here." Ralph Seaton, in a worse place than the trenches, and almost beside himself with fear, hurled the electric lantern like a bomb at the thing which sat in his chair. The heavy lamp hit the stone jamb of the fireplace, shivering its glass and bulb at once. A second afterwards, Ralph heard the window flung wide in the darkness. Then he bolted from the room, and with the sweat running down his spine, fell into a chair in the unlit hall, his heart beating almost to suffocation. After a while he sat up, pulled out his handkerchief, and began to mop his forehead, and it was then that he heard the horn of the Austin. A moving beam of light traversed the hall. Ralph got up. Everdeen must not find him like this. Besides, it might be lurking outside and frighten her. He opened the hall door, and was disgusted to find that his legs would not carry him down the path. "On the dark, old thing," exclaimed his wife a moment later, appearing with her arms full of parcels. "Why ever haven't you lit up?" "Just going to. Drop my lighter," mumbled Ralph. "Haven't found it yet." To himself his voice sounded extraordinary. "But there are matches on the hall mantelpiece," observed Everdeen, dumping her parcels onto the table. "Are you only just in, then? There." She was lighting the hanging Aladdin lamp. Thank goodness one had to leave the flame low at first. Anyhow, perhaps he wasn't looking as queer as he felt, and she wouldn't notice. "Yes, I've been for a walk." "Where are you going?" "I've bought a new waste paper basket for your room," replied his wife briskly, picking up one of her parcels, "and it might as well be put in there at once." "Goodness, Ralph, 2 people can't get through this door at a time." For her husband had pushed past her without ceremony. It might still be in there for all he knew. But directly he had the door well open, he stopped, unable to go a step further, though he could see that the room was empty. And the fact that he could see this was exactly what paralyzed him. One of the 2 never-used candles, which decked the old pewter candlesticks on his mantelpiece, had been lit. Or was he dreaming? Everdeen slipped past. "Well, you managed to get some kind of illumination," she observed. "Oh, you criminal, what a mess, though. You poked the candle into the fire, I suppose by the look of it." Staring at the glowing flame, her husband shook his head. That thing lighted a candle. But no, either it was not what he felt it was, or some human being had come in through the window and lighted that candle. God knew why. Yet on the other hand, was it likely that anyone? But had the thing come back then? "Hello," said Everdeen, stooping down to the hearth. "How did this come here? My goodness, it's all smashed to pieces." She held up in one hand the damaged oak case hand lamp, and in the other a piece of the stout glass of its shattered bullseye. Before he answered, Ralph went to the French window, shut it, and pulled the curtains. Then he came back to the hearth and the solitary candle, which he had not lit. "I'm afraid I'm the culprit about the electric lamp. I don't know whether I'm taking leave of my senses, but... No, for God's sakes, don't sit in that chair, Everdeen." "But why ever not?" exclaimed his wife in utter astonishment, catching the arm which had grabbed at her. Ralph told her why not. It was of no avail to turn the matter over and over, as they did that evening. They could not come to no stable conclusion. On the one hand, it seemed as if it had really one entry to Hallows, and was searching there on its own account. On the other, Captain Seaton had the fervent desire to banish the picture of the sitter by his fireside as a trick of eyesight, the memory of the day, earthy hands rustling over the walls, and the whimpering voice as a trick of hearing, and the affair of the candle as a jest played by someone who had subsequently slipped in through the open window. He slept ill that night, worse than Everdeen. It was not until next day that his wife told him of the likely woman she had heard of in Worcester the preceding afternoon, whose references she had taken up in person, and whom she proposed to engage at once by letter. This domestic would naturally have to live entirely at Hallows, since she was not of the neighborhood. "But what shall we say to this Mrs. Minter when she comes?" asked Everdeen, as she was brushing out her hair at bedtime. "If we tell her never to leave anything open after dark, she'll get frightened about burglars or something, and won't stay." Neither of them had been out since tea time that afternoon, and every door and window had then been securely fastened. Ralph finished winding up his watch and gloomily surmised that anyhow she would hear talk about Hallows in the village. 2 days later, the new servant arrived, respectable, middle-aged, and they hoped unimaginative. Peace descended again, though that Everdeen's nerves were jangled was abundantly proved on the occasion when Minter came in to announce that a man had come for the chest, and got no further. Mrs. Seaton had sprung up with a half-suppressed scream, so that the worthy woman stared at her astounded. "Chest!" cried Everdeen wildly. "No, no, Minter. Send them away at once. We have no..." Luckily her husband came at that instant into the room. He broke in with a loud laugh which did not ring very genuine. "It's all right, Minter. Your mistress has forgotten that the sofa has to go away to be mended. The man is here with the van from Petty's, Everdeen, to fetch the Chesterfield away." Everdeen had recovered herself with a gulp. "I'll go and see about it," she mumbled, and fled from the room. The approach of St. Martin's summer, fine as usual, was bringing visitors again to Hallows, and for a few bright days teas were again in demand. Everdeen was glad of the distraction. On Armistice Day itself, there was quite a number of tears in the living room, for no longer in mid-November could they be accommodated in the kind of arbor which had sheltered them in the summer. They all arrived about the same time, but there were 3 parties of them. That is, 2 parties and one solitary young man who had a table to himself. Everdeen, who was helping Minter with the waiting, thought that he looked like an artist. His hair was rather long, his tie large, his collar soft and loose, and his hands almost a woman's, so long and slim, and with such tapering fingers that they might, thought Everdeen as she served him, have come out of a Van Dyck portrait. He asked for coffee, and would have nothing to eat, and while he stirred it, sat looking round the room with evident interest. And as Everdeen passed again with a tray, he addressed her. "You have a beautiful old house, madam. Do you permit your guests to see over it?" "No, I'm afraid not," answered Everdeen, somewhat taken aback. "Not more than this room. You see, we live here." The young man looked disappointed, much more disappointed than he need, thought Everdeen, seeing his handsome dark face darken, till it was almost sullen. Perhaps he was a connoisseur of old houses, but all the same, they could not undertake to make their home a spectacle to unknown trippers who came for tea, though indeed a tripper was not exactly the word to apply to this young man. "I'm sorry," she added. His face still dark, he made her a sort of bow. "It is your house, madam," and she passed on, feeling that she had been discourteous. Next time she came into the room, he had finished and gone, and paid, which was the important thing, since the 6 pence for his coffee lay on the cloth by the cup. It must have been about 2 o'clock in the morning when Everdeen woke with a jump and the impression that she had heard a noise somewhere near her bed. She lay a moment with her heart beating, but another there came the long rumble of thunder. It had no doubt been a previous clap which had awakened her, and though she disliked thunder by night, she felt relieved. The wind was rising too. She heard a door bang downstairs. Yes, a night thunderstorm always affected her with a sense of something sinister. If it went on, she would wake Ralph, who was sleeping through it. There seemed to be no lightning, which was odd. She never knew which she disliked the more at night. Ah, a flash at last, a slight one, and almost on its heels another, of tropical intensity, blue and searing, which lit up the whole room. But it was not the lightning which drew Everdeen's scream and flung her upon her sleeping husband in the bed by her side. The flash had shown her standing at the foot of her own bed, his hands on the oaken rail, with a half-mocking smile on his face, the young man of the afternoon, and his hands were, "Ralph, Ralph, wake up! He's here in the room with us, but he's dead! His hands are all bones. I saw them. A skeleton's hands. Ralph! He had coffee here this afternoon." Babbling on in terror, she was clinging so hard to him that it was difficult for Captain Seaton to free himself and reach out for the matches, but he succeeded and managed to light the candle, just as a tremendous peal of thunder reverberated over Hallows. "My dear girl, you've had a bad dream. There's nothing, Eve. You really are strangling me." And he broke into one of his uncontrollable fits of coughing. It was perhaps lucky. Nothing else could so have recalled Everdeen to herself. In the morning, the theory of a nightmare seemed the only plank to cling to, if sanity were to be retained by either of them. And as they counted over the week's takings, Ralph Seaton elaborated it with a great show of common sense. "You know, Eve, how you hate thunder in the night, and the fact that you imported it into the dream which it gave you a harmless young tourist or what not from the day before proves. That lot is 10 florins, yes, and 6 half-crowns. You have been doing well, and 6 pence, all right. I'll count them again. I make them 18, but one of them's a dud. You've been had, old lady. Look at that. Is it foreign, or what?" Everdeen took up the rejected coin and looked at it closely on both sides, examined it again, got very red and pale, and let it fall on the table with a little gesture, as though it were something that would sting. "It's not foreign, but it says Jacobus Rex. It's his, Ralph, that he left for the coffee. Oh, what shall we do? What shall we do?" And laying her head upon her arms, she burst into tears. Dr. Mildmay came out of the bedroom and followed Captain Seaton down to the ladder's den. "Yes, I will certainly send your wife a sedative. And what about yourself? You're looking none too grand." "We're both in the same boat, my wife and I," said Ralph, smiling mirthlessly. "And unless this horrible business can be stopped, I really don't know what is going to happen. We can't give up the house. We've only just bought it." Dr. Mildmay was a newcomer to the district, a slight hatchet-faced, forcible man in his 40s, with a little beard and a sallow, dried-up skin. He looked keenly at the haggard man standing before him. Of his physical disabilities he was aware, for Ralph had consulted him soon after settling in Timsfield, and it was Dr. Mildmay who had put him on to the new treatment in Birmingham. "Then you must take the visitant leaves," he said briskly. "Have you ever heard of exorcism?" "Yes. But don't tell me that you're a 20th century medical man. Believe in it. Besides, isn't the object of exorcism to lay a ghost in a house? There's no ghost in the house, at least not permanently. He's outside it, though he evidently intends not to remain there. and after last night it seems as though nothing will keep him out. Then the only course is to take away his reason for coming. What was it he began by asking for? A chest? Look here, Dr. Milne, said Ralph roughly. I don't want to be humored. I am not insane yet. You know quite well that you put down all I have told you to some kind of hallucination or delusion. It is impossible for you, with your training, to do anything else. I'm not a child. How do you know what my training has been? Interrupted Dr. Milne coolly. I spent 10 years as a medical missionary in East Africa. No man who has done that, unless he is unbelievably stupid or invincibly prejudiced, can dogmatize about hallucination or delusions. He has seen far too many strange things himself out there. Ralph stared at him. You really think that I actually saw what I thought I saw, feeling round these walls, sitting in that chair, and that poor Evadine? I would not rule out the possibility, and so one must take steps to put an end to this invasion. It is serious, for you and Mrs. Seton. God knows it is, muttered Ralph. Look here, Mildmay, can't you use some of your African spells or incantations, or exorcise the house yourself? No. As I said, exorcism probably wouldn't answer. It certainly wouldn't in my hands. I'm a layman, Captain Seton. Also, you see, I'm a Christian and can't go in for spells. No, I suggest we start by using common sense. Have you ever tried to find this chest yourself? No, but there's nowhere it could be. The place was as bare as my hand when we came in. No bricked-up cellars, no old wells, no hiding places in the chimneys or in the thickness of the walls. I don't think so. Well, get a good builder and go around the house with him and make sure. Don't have a local man. Get someone out of Worcester or Birmingham. I will look in again tomorrow morning, or you can send for me if you want me. Meanwhile, I'll write off to a historically minded friend of mine in Oxford who has a fairly extensive knowledge of the literature of haunting, and see if he can throw any light on this case. Good morning, and don't frighten yourselves with the far worse bugbear of incipient mental trouble. The builder whom Ralph had out next day from Worcester possessed a certain amount of intelligence, though he was extremely skeptical. Folks is always trying to find what they call priest holes in these here old houses, he observed disparagingly. Can't see what they want 'em for. Nasty, insanitary little places when found, but no one about them old cunning Jesuits would have wanted to live in. Ralph, who had not revealed the ultimate object of the search, replied that such retreats were not inhabited from choice, but was evidently not believed. It was not until the quest, fruitless so far, was almost over that Mr. Wiggins had his great idea, and descending from the attic, went outside the house, stared upwards for some time from the garden, and returned with an expression of satisfaction on his face to the dispirited Ralph, who had been watching him from one of the attic windows. Have it ever occurred to you to wonder, Captain Seton, why this here right-hand casement, he slapped its frame as he spoke, is set so much nearer to the wall than the other one is to the other wall? No, I can't say that it has, returned Ralph. Hallows is an old house, and many things in it are not symmetrical. That's right, but it might have given you an idea, sir, same as it has me. If you had my experience and intelligence, seemed to be understood. Now listen to this. Mr. Wiggins struck a resounding blow on what appeared to be the end of the attic nearest to the right-hand window. Ark at that, sir. It's false. That wall is lath and plaster. There's space beyond it can be calculated from the outside. Not much space, undoubtedly, but enough for one of them skinny Jesuits, I dare say. You've only to give the word, sir, and a aperture's easy made. But Ralph had no intention of interior researches being pursued by Mr. Wiggins, and did not respond to the suggestion. He himself came and thumped the wall, however, puzzled. It's got a beam down it, though, he remarked doubtfully, for a wavy black beam, just a slice of a tree, like many of the timbers and Hallows, divided the distempered surface into two. But this, according to Mr. Wiggins, was but camouflage on the part of them Jesuits, to whom he seemed to attribute the power of continued existence even after what would have amounted to walling up alive. When Mr. Wiggins had departed, Ralph Seaton returned to stare at the shut-off slice of the attic. This could surely only be very narrow, and the departed Wiggins had really been sharp to deduce the possibility of its existence. Dr. Milne was coming tomorrow morning. Possibly he might induce that somewhat unorthodox, or at least singularly unprejudiced medical man to help him break in upon whatever was concealed there, if there was anything. He went to tell Everdeen, still in bed, that there was now a faint hope of the lifting of the siege. Unfortunately, there was also evidence that the blockade was becoming straighter. When the worthy Minter brought Ralph his solitary tea that afternoon, she asked him, in a somewhat indignant tone, whether it were by his wish that the builder's man, as she supposed he was, should be sitting on the attic stairs in the dark, moaning to himself. Drunk he must certainly be, and she would never have let him into the house in that state. But, as it happened, she did not let him in. Her tone seemed to imply that her less observant master must have done so. Ralph put back the tea cozy which he had begun to lift off. On the attic stairs? In the dark? He exclaimed with a sinking of the heart. But I never ordered. Then he checked himself. All right, Minter, I'll see to it. He can't stay there, of course. But don't you tell him. I will. Thank you, sir, replied Minter with indignity, and retired, while Ralph lay back in his chair and groaned, sitting on the attic stairs, moaning to himself. There could be no doubt what was doing that, and now he must go and dislodge the creature. There was one gleam of comfort. Its being where it was seemed to show that Wiggins had been correct, that the attic was the right venue. It also seemed to show that it knew of their doings this morning, and that it could reason. His teacup, the hot toast, the easy chair, and the fire cried strongly to him to remain where he was and let the horror sit and moan on the attic stairs for as long as it liked. The danger was not of fright to Everdeen, who was, he believed, asleep, but to the precious Minter, lest she got an inkling of the real nature of the builder's man. No, it wouldn't do, though, how he was going to expel the thing he knew not, and his flesh crept at the idea of even approaching the narrow stairway leading to the attic. However, he pulled himself out of his chair. Hardly had he got into the hall when he heard a shrill scream from the direction of the kitchen. Great heavens! He hurried there and found Minter, with a face like a sheet, leaning panting against the dresser, clutching a pastry-board shield wise in front of her. "What's the matter?" asked her master with a miserable attempt at jocularity. "Have you seen a rat or something?" "Oh, sir. Oh, Captain Seaton, the most horrible, horrible thing. No, not a rat. Much worse." She shuddered and let slip the board, which fell with a bang between them. "I just got out me rolling pin and put it on the table there by the door, and had me back turned to reach the pastry board when I hear a kind of a swish and a scratching like, and out of the corner of me eye I see something come round the hedge of the door and make a grab at the rolling pin. Something like a hand with a bit of sacking over it and—" "Nonsense, Mintner," interrupted Ralph stoutly. "It was a stray cat, of course. Pull yourself together, woman." "Then perhaps you'll tell me, sir," choked Minter, "how a cat could carry off me rolling pin, because it's gone." There was certainly no rolling pin visible anywhere, even on the floor. An attempt at a suggestion on Ralph's part that she had never put it on the table at all was met by a firm rejoinder that she was, as the captain knew, a member of the Church of England and a strict teetotaler. Then Ralph said, with a sudden air of enlightenment, that of course it was that drunken fellow upstairs, playing her a trick. He would send him about his business in double quick time. Never did anyone feel less like carrying out such a threat than Ralph Seaton as he went slowly upstairs with his repaired electric lamp. All was quiet above. Cheering thought perhaps the invader had not returned to his place of vigil. No moaning, nothing. But just as he got to the corner of the landing, which he must turn before he could see the attic stairs, he stood rooted. What was that rapid series of bumps? One after the other. His hair rising on his head, Ralph set his teeth, slid round the corner and flashed the lamp onto the steep empty stairs. down which was trundling sedately, a pale cylindrical object, the kitchen rolling pin. It came to rest a few stairs from the bottom. Ralph had no wish to pick it up, but stood staring at it as if it had been a cobra. What in the name of heaven was it, descending to the level of a poltergeist? Had it been here a moment ago and dropped the thing? Why had it taken it? Evadine's voice on the landing, sleepy and rather querulous. Ralph, I do think you needn't have chosen just the time when I had gone off to sleep to do hammering up here. But there's been no... He was beginning when it occurred to him that perhaps there had, on the attic door, with the rolling pin, but he could offer neither that explanation nor the other possible one of the bumping descent of that object. He went and induced Evadine to return to bed, humbly apologizing for his thoughtfulness, and he had not thought she could hear. But he did not go to bed at all that night. He sat up till dawn in their bedroom with Jean's Mysterious Universe, which he did not read, and foolishly enough his service revolver loaded. It seems almost a pity, though, said the doctor, surveying the new distemper. It will cost you something to have this mended up again, even if we only make a sort of doorway in it. I don't care what it costs, returned the owner of Hallows, hatchet in hand. I'm going to hoof that damn chest out of there before we both go mad, my wife and I. Come on. And he struck the first blow. It was a messy job, but not very difficult, to cut an inch's way through the lath and plaster, and when it was done, the two men, candle in hand, stepped one after the other into a narrow, darkish place, wider none the less than Ralph had expected. It was neither cold nor damp, but felt very stuffy. Wonder the candles will burn, muttered Ralph, but the air was not really foul. The rafters showed vaguely on high, but draped with cobwebs so filthy that they looked like dirty clothes hung out to dry, and the floor might have been covered with equally dirty flannel, for the foot sank soundlessly into its thick sediment of dust. In one or two places, the candlelight gleamed on small white scraps of bone, relics of bird or mouse or bat, but of a chest nothing at all. Still, Ralph pointed out that on the left hand of the slice of rooms a small oblong mound on the floor, a shape not more than 15 inches high and 3 feet or so long. I will fetch the broom I brought up, he said, stepping back through the gap into the attic. He had foreseen dust, but not so much of it. Dr. Milne had vetoed Evadine's presence in her unstrung condition, and she was downstairs helping Minter in the kitchen. Nevertheless, Ralph had bolted the attic door. There was no key. It was wrong of her, therefore, to disobey orders, and after trying the handle to keep on tapping like that. Go away, Eve, he shouted. You can come in afterwards. Yes, it's all right. We've found something. You promise that I may come in afterwards? Came in indistinctly through the door. Yes, but go away now. And to his relief, he heard her going down the stairs again. I believe this may prove to be a child's coffin, observed Dr. Milne, as Ralph, back in the narrow candlelit space, stared cautiously to use the broom on the dust-covered mound, which, save that the sides were straight, had an outline that gave color to the doctor's surmise. At last Ralph got rid of most of his age-long deposit, and both men, coughing a little, stooped with their candles over a narrow box covered with hide or leather, fastened with blackened nails onto the wood beneath. In many places this leather was cracked and curled, and the little chest was held together by a couple of thin iron bands going right around it. Let's get it out into daylight, said the doctor. By Jove, it's heavy. Treasure, perhaps, commented Ralph. Yet through a memory of Treasure Island brought pieces of vape for a moment into his mind. He did not really believe in such good fortune, and as he got his hands under the narrow leather-covered box, he was conscious of such a spasm of aversion towards it that he had much ado to retain his hold. If it were not that the weight was much too great, he would have said that it contained a skeleton, only surely the skeleton of a dwarf. Together with difficulty, owing to its weight, they got the receptacle through the aperture in the false wall, and when they set it down in full daylight on the clean bare boards, Ralph was aware that Dr. Maltme, too, looked strange. Their eyes met. Whatever is in there is evil, said the man from East Africa in a low voice. and Ralph nodded. Nevertheless, he selected from the tools he had brought up with him a stout chisel and a hammer. I wish I had asked Eve for a duster when she came up to the door just now, he thought, for the box was still pretty grimy. With some difficulty he got to chisel under the first of the iron bands, which at any rate was thin and almost rusted away, and indeed it soon gave way, starting up with a cling. The other band was more difficult and required the aid of pincers as well, but in the end he got it off, and then, as the lock was broken and the leathern hinges rotted away, there was no more to do than raise the lid. "I suppose we had better?" suggested Ralph, hesitating after all. "I think we must," answered his companion firmly, and with that he lifted it off and laid it on the floor. A strange smell, half of damp, half of some withered perfume, came out of the narrow box, out of the folds of rotting brocade, crimson and gold, which loosely covered what was within, and what was within showed enough of its shape to testify that it was a human body, but a body only 3 feet long. Summoning all his resolution, Ralph Seaton pulled the tender, thin stuff aside, and there met his eyes the greenish shape of a perfectly formed woman, clad only in a thin pleated kirtle from waist to knee, save where a fold climbed upwards over one breast and shoulder. A woman, yes, but one who had never lived. For after one wild second's thought of some impossible process of embalming, both men together gasped, "Why, it's a statue." It was. A bronze statue of rather more than half life size of a beautiful workmanship. A nymph, perhaps, for one hand held an arrow, and there were buckskins on her feet. But it was not the work of the ancient world, that was clear, and though the statue was perfect and unworn, it was not modern either. There was a smile on the face, subtle and enigmatic, a little like the smile that Leonardo knew how to paint, in Luini and Boltraffio, too. But it was not an evil smile. Why then had they both been conscious of that feeling of repulsion and almost of fear? "What is this?" asked Dr. Milne, suddenly pointing. "That surely is no part of the original design, for between the breasts of the figure, the one covered, the other exposed, protruded a blackened, cross-shaped object, like the hilt of a small dagger, a silver-hilted dagger perhaps. Below it indeed, when they looked closer, some half-inch of rusty blade was visible, fitting but ill into a jagged rent a little larger than itself. But there was more than the dagger blade in the bosom, which had never felt a wound. There was a strip of paper wound about the rusty steel. The dagger itself would not come away, but Dr. Milne, with neat fingers, picked and unwound the flimsy bit of paper. Even so, when he began to unfold it, it tore. Very silently he held out the tattered thing to Ralph. Captain Seaton could not make sense of what was written on it, words which seemed no words, and signs that conveyed nothing. Shaking his head, he gave it back. "This is rubbish, Doctor. Or, well, I suppose it may prove of interest. What are you after?" He got no answer for a moment. Dr. Milne, looking grim, went back into the recess and returned with one of the still-lighted candles. "Oh, wait a minute," cried Ralph. "Isn't that a pity? The paper may be—" "If you want to be free from that unhappy creature, I fancy this is the way," answered the doctor. "Don't you want to be free?" "God knows I do," answered Captain Seaton, who, after all, was no antiquary. Evedene's health and peace of mind, not to speak of his own, were a great deal more to him than cabalistic writings, so he watched the candle flame making short work of what Dr. Milne had unwound, and saw falling to the floor a few blackened flakes, flimsier than the cobwebs in the place which had hidden, for how many years, he wondered, this poniard nymph lying there before them, with that changeless and secret smile, her head on a little green satin pillow spotted with mold. It was night. Evedene's even breathing showed him that she was soundly asleep, but Ralph could not imitate her example. She had been told everything, had viewed with astonishment and admiration the secret of the chest, and like her husband, had thankfully accepted Dr. Milne's opinion that with the burning of the strip of paper wound about the dagger, they might reasonably expect Hallows to be free from its inopportune visitor. Nevertheless, Ralph was restless. He almost felt fevered. That little statue, he lay picturing it set up on a pedestal. It would surely look even more beautiful so. They had not yet lifted it out of its bed, its coffin. What was to be done with it eventually? Had they a right to keep it? He supposed so. Then he would have had that evasive smile to look at always, and the turn of the head, which must be more lovely, more significant, if the nymph were as she was created to be, upright against a forest tapestry of greens and browns. For nearly an hour he lay thinking about her, and then rose very quietly from his bed, put on his dressing gown, and crept out of the room, carrying a candlestick. He did not strike a match until he was outside. Why not be the first to see what she looked like, standing in her half-naked loveliness up there in the bare attic? Though she was heavy, she was not large. He was sure that he could lift her out of the coffer unaided. Odd, he thought, as he went stealthily up the attic stairs, that antiquated word should have come thus unbidden into his mind. He wished now that he had not allowed the strip of paper with the writing to be burnt. It might have told him something about his nymph, for she was his now. Dr. Milne was, well, he had been a missionary. Apparently he was a man of very narrow ideas. Yes, he himself had been a damned fool to let him burn that writing. This reflection reminded him of the dagger, that cruel dagger whose thrust had not destroyed her imperishable life, but which he hated to think of. He would have another try at getting it out. An excellent and almost imperative reason for this nocturnal visit. All the same, he must be a trifle feverish, for he opened the attic door almost as though he were entering a shrine. He was aware of this and knew the feeling to be absurd, more especially as the goddess which it contained was lying tied up in a box. For the attic door, having no key, Dr. Milne and he had fastened up the chest again in 2 places with stout cord. However, he could soon undo it. But even that was not necessary. He gazed down, astonished. The cords were no longer round the coffer, though they were still underneath it, lying spread upon the floor, and by the ends of them he could not help seeing, that they had neither been untied nor cut. They had never been burst apart. Who on earth could have done such a thing? Who could have the strength? Ralph set down the candle with a shaking hand and dropped to one knee. For a moment he dared not move the lid, which was still in place, though a little crooked. It was obvious what had happened. Someone had got into Hallows and stolen her. She was no longer there. He should never see that smile again. There would only be the empty coffin. Steeling himself, he took away the lid. His heart leapt up. She was there still. She was there. He took up the candle from the floor and held it over her, drinking in her beauty. And it was only after a moment or two that he noticed something different about her. The blackened dagger hilt was gone. The weapon was gone altogether. There was only the tiny rent between the shapely little breasts. Ralph Seaton felt an immense relief and gladness. Now there was nothing to mar her beauty, and nothing any longer to cause her pain. He could kneel on forever just looking at her. Not, however, if he continued to have the strong conviction that he was being watched, and watched by someone or something hostile. He tore his gaze away and sent it searching around the dark and empty attic. No one, of course, nothing, unless that was a face peering at him through the breach in the false wall. No, mere fancy. He looked down again fondly at that perfect visage. Her hair rose high above her lovely brow, higher than the classical statues which he had seen. She was more human than they. The Gioconda smile seemed to flicker about her smile as the candle flame bent and wavered in the draught. It seemed to invite him, and had he not a right to it, he who had freed her from her long entombment, who was restoring her to the light of day and to her meed of admiration, to background of woodland tapestry, with perhaps a crystal bowl of flowers at her feet? "My beautiful one," he whispered, and bent to kiss the smile. How cold she was, how long and unsatisfying the kiss, how curious the sensation that a heavy weight upon the back of his neck, almost like a hand, was pressing his head down into the coffer, against the unyielding bronze and the rotting, faintly scented brocade. But there was something, gripping him there and pressing unmercifully. He tried to shout, but it was like a nightmare, for he was dumb. He struggled as desperately and as powerlessly as one struggles in a nightmare. Then, thank God, the nightmare broke and he was crouching on the floor by the box, sweating all over his hands to his neck. What had he been doing? He, Ralph Seaton, stealing up at a dead of night to kiss a statue? A statue? He must have gone mad, quite mad, shamefully mad. But was it madness or returning sanity, which brought to his ears a sound like a low laugh, which seemed to come from that dark place of discovery at the end of the attic? No, he was not mistaken. He had been watched at his undefensible worship. Shame and sudden fury set him on his feet. Leaving the candle where it was on the floor, he made a rush at that dark cavity. Come out! Whoever you are, come out, and don't snigger in there. He caught his foot as he rushed in and half tripped, so that only the close proximity of the opposite wall saved him from falling. Then, as he recovered and turned, beating about in the darkness to discover the invisible mocker, he thought instantly, mustn't stop in here more than a moment. The air is foul. My poor old lungs won't stand it. So he swung around to face the opening, and then stood motionless, framed by the jagged aperture, bright and clear, though the only light there was the candle on the floor. A young man in a ruff and a short black velvet cloak was kneeling by the open coffer, his head bowed, his hands outstretched in a gesture that looked like entreaty. Every slash of purple in his green doublet, every stiffened fold of his ruff, every curl of the golden gallant round the edge of his cloak was as distinct as the details in a pre-Raphaelite picture, even to the glint of a jewel in his left ear. His face Ralph could not see, and the whole vision, sharp cut though it was, lasted but the space of a lightning flash, and when it was gone, left the dark of a night of thunderstorm behind it. Captain Seaton gasped, put a hand for a moment over his eyes, and then groped unsteadily for the aperture. Though the candlelight in the room beyond had been unaccountably swallowed up, he could find the gap by feeling, since for one thing, it could not be more than a foot or two from his hand. God, what had become of it? He could feel nothing, not even the false wall. There was nothing round him anywhere, in any direction, but darkness, a thick, soft, choking darkness. And now his heart, his brain, were beating fit to burst. When he tried to draw a deep breath, there was nothing to breathe but dust, dust. He fell on his knees in dust. Dust was whirling down upon him in the warm gloom. Dust was up in his nostrils, in his mouth, in his very vitals. The way out of this place was lost, blocked, gone. With his damaged lungs, he must stifle here. He was stifling. Dust thou art, and to dust thou shalt return. But she had not been dust, and that was why this had happened. Poor Eve. But his life was insured. Gas masks, men, gas masks. Quick! He went down and down through spinning eternities of dust and suffocation. If Everdeen had not wakened and missed him, if she had not heard the sound of hasty feet in the attic above, if her husband had not left the attic door ajar so that the light shone down, who knows? But these things told Everdeen with voices of alarm, and with another candle she ran up the stairs and saw the first one still burning on the floor by the side of the open coffer. It did not take her long to find Ralph, but strong though she was, she had to tug hard to pull him out, asking herself all the time what could have possessed him to enter that place at such a time. She flung the attic windows wide. She fetched remedies. Gradually the blueness ebbed from his lips, and he began to come round. She helped him to bed, asking for no explanation. As soon as it was daylight, she went herself for Dr. Mildmay. What Ralph told the doctor she did not know. To her, later, he merely said that he had undoubtedly had a touch of fever, had had it before he went to bed, but had not bothered to tell her. But he avoided her eyes and seemed altogether strange as well as ill. However, he recovered, and recovered so completely as to be able to inform her a few days later that he was going to supper with Dr. Mildmay and might be back rather late. She herself had helped the doctor to fasten up the nymph again, and to wrap the whole chest in brown paper, so that it looked like an entirely modern and ordinary parcel, though out of the ordinary, heavy, and the doctor had had it fetched away to his own house. She understood that some art dealer was coming to look at it there. but on the evening that Captain Seaton supped with him, Dr. Milne fetched out his car afterwards, and he and Ralph lifted the box into it, and they drove through the sleeping village without a single touch on the horn, until they came to the old canal, where earlier the autumn leaves had lain unstirring, as on some road of glass. They took the wrapped coffer out and carried along the verge to the old wooden high arch bridge, which somewhat shakily now spanned the canal, and from the middle of this they lowered what they carried with a rope, so much precaution to avoid the sound of a splash in the still autumn night. The heavy thing slid gently into the sluggish water, and the rope, weighted at the end, followed it down. Thick bubbles came up as it reached the mud, bubbles of marsh gas. After that, the water rocked a little, and the widening circle spread out more and more, faintly under the stars, and that was all. Dr. Milne wiped his forehead. May she rest in peace. And he, too. Ralph Seaton was silent for a moment. After that night, he had never wished to look upon the face of his nymph again, nor had he. Do you think he will sleep, or will he look for her here? Who can tell? At least he can vex no human now. But I think that after he had withdrawn the dagger, it was over for him, and that you witnessed his very last appearance. Come back with me now, and I will show you what my friend at Oxford has sent me, and you shall judge. The doctor's study was homely and comfortable after the sleeping canal and that midnight drowning. Come to the fire, you're shivering, said its owner, and when he had settled his guest in a chair and mixed him a whiskey and soda against his principal, as he informed him, he drew out a letter. This is what my friend Dawkins of Corpus says. I must tell you first, though, that I only put the case to him as a ghost story which I had recently heard. I did not state that it was actually the present experience of a patient of mine. I have identified your ghost for you, I think, though I have not come across its name. I remembered to have read the tale you passed on to me some years ago in a book called Curiosities of the Supernatural, a collection made by a rather credulous Victorian parson, the Reverend Thomas White, who died about 1860. I got out this volume at the Bodleian and found what I had almost forgotten, that the reverend author of the Curiosities had not told the story in his own words, but had lifted it bodily from a 17th century pamphlet containing apparently several such yarns. But the tiresome old cleric omits to mention either the title of the pamphlet or the name of its writer. Here, however, is the passage as he gives it. And what shall be said of that young gallant of the time of good King James, who being violently enamored of a young and fair French gentlewoman that would none of his suit, and but mocked at him, caused make a copy in bronze of that beauteous Diana, wherein that sculptor of so great parts, Monsieur Jean Goujon, did immortalize both the Lady Diane of Poitiers and himself, the which statue was held to resemble as closely this young, scornful beauty as once it had resembled that famous bedfellow of a king. What shall be said of this disdained lover, that took with him to England this simulacrum of his lady in a coffer, and being come there, did wickedly pierce the breast of the twice likened Artemis, and in that bloodless wound set a silver dagger wound about with charms, which charms, whether by his knowledge and consent or against it, did cause the death of his proud mistress within the year, and he, being gone, it is thought, to the Indies or the Spanish Main, knew not of it, and then in captivity of the Spaniards still less than not. But after many years returning to England and desiring to see again the image of his dearest love, whom he had done to death, sought it over the length and breadth of the land, and could not by any means find it, till about the time the late bloody tyrant Oliver began to raise his horn, he was near finding it, but by ill fortune, before he came at it, was himself slain, being then about 65 years of age, bearing arms for our late sovereign Lord King Charles II at Worcester fight, and that by a mortal thrust in the very spot where he had so impiously transfixed the statue, which statue continues lost until this day, and 'tis said that he still seeks after it, sometimes in the semblance of a young man, sometimes as an old one, Yet, since it appears that he may enter no place in search of it that he be not bidden to enter, 'twould seem that this poor phantom must continue his quest forever. Nevertheless, 'tis certain that the effigy lies somewhere hid in the county of Worcester. I was right about the paper, you see, said Dr. Milmay, laying down the letter. Yes, you were right. And so the nymph was Diana herself. And now we have drowned her. Goujon was a famous Renaissance sculptor, wasn't he? But she was a copy, the one we found? Yes, and a copy, apparently, of a work of his which is now lost. I don't know much about him myself, but Dawkins, who is a perfect mine of information, has a postscript on that point. Dr. Milmay took up his friend's letter again and turned it sideways. He says that it has been supposed by some critics that there existed another masterpiece besides the famous Diana, now in the Louvre, the one where the goddess is seated with her arm around the neck of a stag, because in the 18th century somebody called, can't quite make it out, but it looks like Pignon, spoke enthusiastically of another nymph in the orangery of the Chateau Vannes, where the Diana of the Louvre comes from. Yes, I see, said Ralph Seaton, looking fixedly at its untouched glass, but why did you wait until after our expedition of this evening to read me this, Doctor? To be perfectly frank with you, because I thought the nymph was better out of the way. But if you regret what we did, if you think that she is valuable and that you could sell her, why, she is not yet sunk so deep that she cannot be fished up again. Dr. Milmay spoke cheerfully, but he was looking at his visitor with a gaze not devoid of anxiety. No, no, answered Ralph Seaton with a slight shiver. I would not condemn even an art collector to the possibility of going through what we have been going through. I suppose, by the way, that he was encouraged to begin again by our opening a tea shop at Hallows, which gave him a kind of right of entry, as into an inn, and I myself must have invited him into the attic, for my wife denies that it was she at the door when I shouted, "You can come in afterwards." No, let's have no more of that. I'm all for the Englishman's castle now, the sanctity of the home, and that sort of thing. And with a rather strained laugh he drank off his whiskey and soda.